Hello and welcome to Fueling the Transition, the podcast series from AFRY Management Consulting that's all to do with decarbonisation, decentralisation and digitalisation of the energy sector as we approach net zero. My name's Matt Brown. I'm Vice President in the Management Consulting Division at AFRY, and I'm responsible for the energy practice. I'm very pleased to welcome Nick Eyre to the podcast. And Nick is a professor of energy and climate policy and senior research fellow in energy at the Environmental Change Institute and a supernumerary fellow at Oriel College. Nick, hello and welcome.
Hello, Matt. It's nice to be here.
Excellent. And with me also, I have my colleague, Bettina Wittneben. Bettina is looking after our ESG areas in the UK. Hello, Bettina.
Hi, very nice to be here.
Wonderful. Nick, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit further and say what areas of work you're looking at in terms of energy and climate policy?
Thanks, Matt. Yes, so as you said, I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at the University of Oxford. My day job is Director of the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, which is a large cross-university interdisciplinary centre looking at energy use, energy demand, energy efficiency, mainly in the UK. I'm also an acting co-director of a new institute in the University of Oxford that's just been set up called the Zero Institute, and Zero stands for Zero Carbon Energy Research Oxford, which tells you what the institute will be doing over the next few years. So that's more broadly looking at the energy transition, but most of my background over the last 30 years or so has been on energy use.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for that. And just sort of jumping straight in, I'm wondering what's been your motivation? What's been your driving force, if you like, in your work?
Well, I guess I was always, from being a child, interested in the way the world worked, and that took me into physics. And then I perhaps naively thought that you could learn more about the world by digging inside and looking at how smaller and smaller things worked and what matter was composed of. So that took me to nuclear physics and then into nuclear energy. I was also then learning that actually just taking things to pieces isn't the way you learn the way about the world works, that there's the social issues, there's systemic issues. And I got interested in those as well. And whilst I was working for the UK Atomic Energy Authority, moved over to the unit that they had that worked on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And that's how I began the career in that area.
Wonderful. And I was also at AAT in the Energy Technology Support Unit, but I think you'd just left as I was joining as a young consultant there.
Yeah, you're just a youngster, Matt, yes.
Yeah, yeah, not so much anymore, I suppose.
I just want to follow up on that. What is your fascination with energy, though? What is the curiosity behind that? What drives you every day to be thinking about these problems?
I guess I learned at quite an early age that energy was pretty critical in environmental issues. I've always been interested in environmental issues, and most of the problems that people talked about back in those days, acid rain, air pollution, they were linked to energy. I come from a part of the world, the north of England, where the Industrial Revolution started. And so I sort of had that understanding that energy was pretty fundamental to the way that the world had developed, both the benefits it gives us, but also the downsides too.
I see. And tell us a bit more about Zero, which you set up at the University of Oxford, and the new Energy Systems Transition Hub in Oxford's Osney Mead. What does this hub do, and who's all part of it? And can you just walk in there and talk about energy? What happens?
Well, it's all very new. We're just getting it off the ground, really, Bettina. So there's two things that you mentioned. There's the Zero Institute, which, as I said, stands for Zero Carbon Energy Research Oxford. And that's an institute of the university. It's been pulled together by colleagues from engineering science, from the School of Geography and Environment, and from materials department as well. So it's quite interdisciplinary, aiming to look at some of the systemic issues in the energy transition. I think Oxford and probably universities more generally, because they tend to be departmentally focused, are quite good at looking at individual components of what we need for the energy transition. I say they're quite good at looking at pieces of the jigsaw, but not so much the whole jigsaw. So the things we want to look at are things that cut across the range of issues, are more systemic in character. So there'll be programs on energy demand reduction, on heating and cooling, on interconversion between electricity and hydrogen, things that in Oxford we've got a bit of an interest in, but probably haven't developed as much as we should have, and are critical for the energy transition. So Zero Institute is an institute of the university. We're just advertising for a permanent director now, so we'll be able to say a lot more about the future direction in a few months' time. The institute will be located in a new building called TESA. TESA stands for the Energy System Accelerator, and this is a really exciting development as far as the university is concerned. As you said, it's on Oasney, which is an old industrial area quite close to the city centre that's being redeveloped by the university, and this will be one of the premier buildings in that area. And it's unique as far as Oxford's concerned because it won't just be for the university. It will have people in it from business, from industry, from the public sector, from a range of organisations, all of whom are interested in the energy transition. And it's founded on the pretty simple proposition that if you put people in the same place and give them space to work and talk to each other day to day, not once a year, then you will get faster innovation and hopefully make a bigger and quicker contribution to the transition.
That sounds like a really good idea.
So, Nick, AFRY specialises in modelling energy demand, supply and prices, as you may know, and we help our clients meeting energy demand using sustainable solutions. But I think your work certainly looks in energy demand in much more detail, how it's formed. What are the drivers? What policies can influence energy demand? What are you finding in your work?
So you're right, Matt. We think about energy demand from a pretty fundamental start. What do we use energy for? What services do we get energy for? And then there's a fairly simple proposition that the amount of energy that we use depends on the amount of those energy services and how efficiently we can shift energy into those services, so the energy efficiency of final conversion. And therefore, if we want to reduce energy demand, which we think will be a really important part of the energy transition, then we need to think about both the energy services and the energy efficiency with which they're delivered. And the work we've been doing for the UK shows that we could probably halve energy demand by 2050 if we do both of those things, if we address both of those. And that's pretty consistent with the work that's been going on in other developed countries and has been summarised by the IPCC. So we're pretty confident that energy demand and the reduction of it can make a very significant contribution to the transition. A big part of that comes from electrification. As I'm sure most people listening to this podcast will know, if you electrify transport, you tend to get a huge efficiency improvement because electric vehicles are more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. The same is true in heating, which is the other big energy use in cool and cold climates, because heat pumps are much more efficient than boilers. So the transition itself helps energy efficiency, and energy efficiency helps the transition. We can see a real synergy between the two.
Is that reducing by 50% what the demand would have been otherwise, or reducing it from today's level down to 50%?
That's absolute. That's a change between 2020 and 2050. We don't think that even in the worst case scenario, energy demand would go up a great deal. We would expect efficiency to improve at some rate anyway. And the demand for energy services is probably going to go up less, even in the worst case scenario, than it has done historically. That's because most of the more energy intensive activities of human beings, things like energy intensive manufacturing, heating, most aspects of transport, we're sort of beginning to saturate demand. So some things are actually beginning to fall off already, such as we're seeing that car ownership and use amongst younger generations is actually now lower than amongst older generations.
Interesting. And I know my 3 kids, none of them have a driving license yet, which means I keep on having to drive them everywhere, which is getting a bit. I keep on trying to persuade them, but they're living in London and they're happy on the tube or their bikes. So anecdotal,
Yeah, and we had that anecdotal evidence as well, and we thought it was probably confined to cities, and particularly large cities like London, where you've got excellent public transport. But actually, the effect does seem to occur even in rural areas as well. Now, whether that's because kids today spend all their time looking at mobile phones and don't have time to go anywhere, I don't know. But it's not fully understood why this change is happening.
Okay. And then you talked a little bit about, energy demand structurally in terms of heavy industry. Is that because from a UK perspective, heavy industry is going elsewhere? And so, from a UK PLC viewpoint, we'll be importing energy intensive things into the country rather than making them?
Well, that's definitely happened over the last 20 years. We've exported some of our more energy intensive activities, particularly to East Asia. It's perhaps hard to see that trend continuing unless we completely eliminated heavy manufacturing in the UK, which I think rightly there'd be some political resistance to. But I think we can think about it, if we think about it from the consumption end. Use of steel, use of cement can probably be reduced quite a lot by better design, by better product recycling. And so when you start to look at how to reduce demand, you're not only looking at the energy system and things that I've talked about, but you are looking at circular economy issues, you're looking at wider transport systems and mobility systems, even looking at the food system and how we can get better food with less energy input. And when you look at most of these systems of provision, there's quite a lot of inefficiency in them. And you mentioned at the beginning that we're thinking about the role of digitalization in this. Digitalization can contribute to a lot of these trends by providing better information and control.
Yeah. And it seems to me that we've not been doing terribly well so far. And I don't know whether that's just my bias, but in terms of either overall energy efficiency in the UK and improvements in energy efficiency, is it possible to measure, looking back, how we've been doing against what a counterfactual may be in terms of energy efficiency, and then in terms of bringing digital tools in to do a better job? Well, how do you think that's going?
Yeah, the historical point's an interesting one. With the former head of the Energy Technology Support Unit, Ian Lees, I did a retrospective on the last 30 years a couple of years ago, and we looked back at a report we did then, which projected how much energy efficiency we might get by 2020, which when we did it seemed like a long way away and no one would ever check up. But we did check up on ourselves, and we'd actually done somewhat better on energy efficiency than we thought. Energy efficiency had contributed more than anything else to carbon emissions reduction over those 30 years. But I have to say the last 10 years has probably been not such a good story. I think policy has gone backwards in a number of areas. You can think of transport taxation, but perhaps particularly the housing sector, residential energy demand, energy efficiency programs have been cut back pretty significantly over the last 10 years, and that's clearly got issues now for carbon emissions, but also for energy security.
So, Nick, would you say that we need to combine the solutions we already have in a new way or more intensively? Or are there new solutions on the horizon that you see coming for energy demand reduction or addressing energy efficiency?
There's always going to be some new solutions as technology improves, but clearly if we're going to improve efficiency quickly over the next 10, 20 years, which is probably what we need to do for climate reasons, we're going to be using largely the technology that is there. There is no magic bullet in this area. Energy use is spread across our economy. As I said, the fossil fuel transition, the transition into fossil fuels that happened in the Industrial Revolution means that almost all our activities now in advanced societies are based on fossil fuels, and therefore it's quite a lot of things that need to change: the way we make things, the way we travel about, the way we heat our homes, these are all going to have to change if we're going to get to net zero. That's sometimes a difficult message to get over. People, in many ways, like to think there's a magic bullet solution to this, but sadly there isn't.
So is it consumer behavior that has to change, or government policy, or is it the companies that need to work harder towards net zero goals?
Yes, all of those. So finance, manufacturing, commercial offers, business models, consumer behavior, social practices. I think it's unrealistic to think we'll get to a zero carbon transition globally by persuading 7 billion people individually to change their ways. We have to think of it in a more organized and structured way, which is why I think that large businesses, particularly energy sector businesses, but particularly governments, have got a crucial role to play. If we want change in the way that people travel, change in people's homes, it's government policy, government regulations, incentives, advice programs that are going to be central to delivering that. That's not to provide a cop-out for us individually and say we don't have a role, we do, but I think the structure needs to be there first and foremost.
And are there, in the UK at the moment, are there suitable policies for improving energy efficiency and reducing energy demand?
In general, no, particularly in the residential sector. As I mentioned, we've cut back our programs, we've cut back both the obligations on energy companies to do energy efficiency for their customers, and we've cut back on the advice programs for households and small businesses. So we're not in a good state at the moment, and we need to change that pretty quickly to address this really triple crisis that we now face of affordability, security risks, and climate change.
Do you think it's, if we think of something like, putting solar panels on roofs or improving residential household insulation, are those things that can be ramped up quickly?
I think that depends what you mean by quickly, Matt. If it can certainly be done in a number of years, and needs to be done in a number of years, but it does require training, it requires capacity building in the relevant sectors. So it's not going to happen in a matter of months. It means that as far as the immediate affordability crisis is concerned, we can say that running down our energy efficiency programs has been a bad idea and has made that worse. It can tell us that we ought to ramp them up again, and that will help us in any future crisis in this area. But sadly, the immediate affordability crisis is going to have to largely be addressed through incomes and prices, and not through the long-term solution of using less energy or using energy more efficiently.
Maybe if we focus on heating and cooling a little bit more broadly, obviously that's a massive part of our energy demand. What approaches are there to address lowering energy demand for heating and cooling beyond maybe the insulation part?
So I think the first thing it's worth saying is that yes, they're huge, but they're geographically quite different. So globally, we expect that cooling might be at least as significant an energy user as heating by mid-century, though it isn't yet. But clearly, that's will be largely due to growth in economies in hotter parts of the world. In Northern Europe, heating is still going to be massively more important than cooling. So cooling, we can largely decarbonize in two ways. The first is to avoid mechanical cooling where we can, and people have known how to do this for, well, literally thousands of years through passive design of buildings. Quite why we can't put shutters on buildings in the way that the Romans did isn't entirely clear to me. We ought to be able to do those sorts of relatively straightforward, low-tech measures, but better design of buildings, higher thermal mass in buildings will be important in stopping there being a huge increase in the need for mechanical cooling in the sorts of climates that you and I live in. So heating will be the dominant issue in Northern Europe, in most of Europe, in fact. the only way really to decarbonise most of heating is I think going to be through using decarbonised electricity. Biofuels may be able to make a significant contribution in countries where, well, crudely speaking, there's a lot of trees and not very many people. But in countries with a lot of people and not very many trees, we're going to have to look to other solutions. Electricity and hydrogen are the obvious candidates. I think in the short term, it's going to be electricity, and that means we have to look at electric heat pumps, because that's the way we combine zero carbon with energy efficiency. If we try simply to decarbonise by using just electricity as resistive heating, the demand for electricity goes through the roof. So we are going to have to use efficient technologies, and that probably means heat pumps.
When I look on LinkedIn, quite often I see people who are very pro heat pumps and anti-hydrogen for heating. Other people who are very pro hydrogen for heating and anti-heat pumps. Are you on one side or the other?
I try not to be on a side, just as a matter of principle. I think in any area like this, where you know there's a major change coming and there's competing solutions, you're going to get people who take one position or the other as a matter of principle or through vested interest, to put it bluntly. I think there will be a role for both myself, but I think we're not going to be in a position to expand hydrogen over the next 10 years. We're just too far away from the testing and demonstration that's needed to run homes off hydrogen. So I think we'll have to start with heat pumps, and I suspect they may therefore get an advantage in the market that means that they become the dominant technology. They have an advantage in that they use energy more efficiently compared to using hydrogen in a boiler. You could, of course, use hydrogen in a heat pump or a CHP system or something else that had high efficiency. But my guess is that heat pumps will predominate in most parts of the market, perhaps an exception in areas where we'll be using hydrogen in industrial processes, and so there'll be a hydrogen infrastructure in place that's around some of the major industrial areas.
In terms of heat pumps and the ability to fit them to existing housing stock, what else do we need to do to make it comfortable?
That's a very straightforward question. It doesn't seem to have a very widely agreed answer. I mean, we know that well-insulated houses can use heat pumps pretty effectively at the moment. We know that very badly insulated houses need to have their insulation improved before it's sensible to put in a heat pump, simply because the efficiency of heat pump that you get in a very inefficient building is poor. But where to draw the line between them, my colleagues or expert in these areas have some different opinions. I think we're going to have to do some learning by doing here. We're going to have to roll out heat pumps in areas that we're certain there'll be a good solution, and in areas where we're not so certain. It's not clear at the moment how, in the areas where there have been problems, and let's be clear, there have been problems in some cases with heat pump installations. It isn't clear to what extent the problem is fundamentally to do with the type of housing, or to what extent it's to do with the installation and operation not being as good as it should be. So there's learning to do, and we will doubtless make mistakes. But if we don't get on and start doing things, we won't get that learning.
My memory tells me that Sweden is somewhere with very good heat pump penetration already. And so it seems it's perfectly possible, even in colder climes.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly, it's possible in countries a lot colder than the UK. In very cold conditions, you're better off using a ground source heat pump than an air source heat pump, because you can use temperature underground, which is at the annual average rather than at the cold weather temperature that you're running an air source heat pump off. But unfortunately, Swedish housing is not necessarily a great indicator for what would happen in UK housing, because Swedish housing is so much better built, is typical in the UK housing stock.
And so therefore, as you say, this learning by understanding any issues as they come up, that's a process which needs to go on. Any idea how long it could be before we're fully on top of all of those issues in the UK?
Fully on top of is a dangerous phrase, isn't it? I don't think we'll ever be fully on top of the issues. I think there's a serious question about whether we can reach the government's target of 600,000 new installations of heat pump a year by 2028. I think that's a very ambitious target. There's certainly, the government in that area has certainly been better at setting ambitious targets than putting in place the policies to realise them. We should try to reach that target. It's there for a reason. It's there because that's what the Climate Change Committee and government think puts us on a track to delivering a 2050 net zero target. And if we're going to do that, we will need to start deploying heat pumps in much larger numbers than we have been doing pretty much now. I think it's got serious implications for those of us who work in research. It means we're probably going to have to move more research out of laboratories and into the field to pick up those problems and address them quickly as they happen.
Talking about different governments approaching things differently in different countries. So I'm both British and German, and there are very different narratives coming from the governments. In Germany recently, Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Robert Habeck, he's basically asking people to buy a new shower head to save water and energy. Whereas in the UK, the government's narrative is more that the price signal will make people change their behavior anyway, and therefore we don't need to give practical tips to people. We don't need to push people in these ways, or provide other incentives, because the price signal will act like that. Does one work better than the other, or does it really incentivize people in a similar way? Or what effects do these different approaches have from governments?
There's clearly some ideological issues around the choices that governments make, but I think the research is now pretty clear that the most effective approach uses a combination of different policy instruments. That's perhaps not surprising, but it's not one that policy analysts have identified until the last 10 years or so. So if you think about the sort of policies that can be deployed, whether it's in water saving or energy saving, probably the most effective approach on its own is product standards, i.e., if you're interested in people having low flow shower heads, why do you sell high flow shower heads? We've done that very effectively in Europe with refrigerators, so you can't buy the most inefficient sort of refrigerators. Consumers are not up in arms about that, saying we demand the right to buy inefficient refrigerators, because that would be a pretty silly thing to get up in arms about, but actually because they don't even know. In most cases, it's a quiet bit of policy making that's been done effectively in the background. So standards can set a minimum sort of level. I think incentives on top of that, whether that's price incentives through the energy price or through differential prices for different efficiency equipment, that can also make a difference. But any economic signal is clearly most effective if the market is working properly, and we know one of the conditions for a market to work properly is that the participants in the market have good information. And most energy users in homes don't have very good information. They don't know what their energy is used for. They don't know how much it would cost to reduce that. They don't know how to do that. So it sort of intuitively makes sense anyway, but actually research confirms it's a combination of standards, incentives, and advice and information works best. And so I find it a fairly irritating debate that one is better than the other when we already know that a combination is best.
I think at the moment still we have the labelling scheme on white goods. Is that right, Nick?
Meaning those of us who are in the UK, Matt, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
We do. Technically, the label is different. It's a UK label rather than a European label. But that means it's got UK on it rather than EU. The actual standards themselves at a technical level were adopted into UK law when we left the EU. So we currently have the same standards, but not entirely clear whether there's a commitment to improve those standards if and when the EU improves its standards. By improve, I mean making them tighter. So that's been the trend over the last few years. I'd expect that to continue. In Europe, the consultation documents from UK government last year implied that the UK would at least follow, perhaps even go faster. But some of the political statements we hear about EU so-called red tape might make you think that governments led by some people might want to go in the opposite direction. So I think we're in a pretty uncertain position on that in the UK. But there's no doubt it's been a major factor in reducing our electricity use in the UK and across Europe over the past couple of decades.
How wide are the standards now? Because I seem to remember it's got ratings of like AA to E or something on a sticker on the side of the machine. And did they retire? They improved over time. It's effectively like retiring the worst performing ones over a period, is it?
So that the standards tend to increase over time, but only slowly, and that's done by eliminating a whole category. So for white cold goods, as we call them, refrigerators, freezers, you couldn't buy anything worse than a C after the standard was introduced. Then there's a separate process of rebasing the standards, which happened on a lot of goods last year. So something that was being sold, and that's because we ended up in a situation where virtually everything was A rated. So they had to invent A+ and A++ ratings, which frankly wasn't very helpful, and everybody knew that. So they were rebased so that the mix of products on the market now looks much worse than it did 2 years ago, but actually it's the same or a bit better, and that will allow the market to work better, because clearly if people see they've got a choice between a C and an A, then they're likely to interpret that correctly as the A being more efficient.
Okay, but it might be better just that they don't have a choice at all and that everything's A, from what you said before.
Well, I wouldn't have everything A. I would say eliminate below a certain level and then have a spectrum where you use the A to H, A to E, whatever you choose as an indicator of efficiency above that standard, so that consumers who are purchasing can get a good indication of what the range is.
So still some choice for the consumer to be able to have a balance.
Definitely. Well, we're always going to have a range of different efficiencies on the market, but I think there's a very good case for eliminating things that don't make a reasonable standard, and for increasing that over time as the technology improves.
And the same, I suppose, could be said of in the past in car manufacture, improving efficiency standards. I guess that has had quite a big impact, has it, in terms of our energy demand overall? Yes,
it's somewhat fallen off in recent years, and of course there have been a well-known high-profile scandals around the accuracy with which vehicle manufacturers reported, particularly actually some of the other emissions, including CO2, and all sorts of things that a reasonable person would consider cheating going on. So in the trials, you take the wing mirrors off, for example, so that you reduce air resistance. So there's, as in other areas, a constant battle between business and regulator. But yeah, over a period of time, certainly standards for cars have played quite a big role in Europe. It's worked in a slightly different way in that manufacturers have been set a corporate average to meet. That's true in the US as well, with their corporate average fuel efficiency standard. So it means that a manufacturer can produce a range of different cars, large and small in particular, because otherwise you would simply drive the whole market towards smaller cars, which policymakers, presumably largely policymakers who drive big cars, didn't think was desirable.
I remember some years ago looking at the US car and passenger driving market, whatever one would call it, and there was in the category of car there'd been an efficiency improvement, but there'd also been a large trend to much bigger, heavier cars at the same time. So actually there was no overall improvement shown, because people were getting into driving, Humvees and whatever else, large trucks in the US.
Yeah, that's right. Again, it's a battle that the regulator has to fight. What is a car was the battle in this case, and utility vehicles were outside the range of what was deemed to be a car, and therefore outside the standards.
Yeah. So constant battle between the regulation and the company. Although, Bettina, I would guess with more and more ESG focus, and perhaps more formalization of exactly what ESG means in certain areas, that perhaps companies will be trying to get ahead of the curve rather than battling against the regulator.
Absolutely. And it's also, the demand is also coming from the investors to find out who are the good guys in the market, who do I want to invest in, if the aim of the fund. And to find that out, companies will be under more pressure to report ESG metrics, and these metrics will become more and more standardized so that they can be compared across companies. Yes, I would definitely say that.
Very good.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's changed in the last few years, is the sense that largely because civil society is demanding better performance, particularly on climate change, that there is now a corporate and finance driver for these changes as well.
So I think at that point, maybe we'll turn to one thing that's very much in the news, and that's around the cost of living crisis, the geopolitical situation of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Bettina, over to you.
Yeah, so of course we have commodity prices and energy prices at a historical high right now, both because of the pandemic and the Russian invasion. And this has been driving the consumer really to the boundaries of what's possible. And we're hearing really unbelievable numbers of future predictions of the cost of living crisis and what's happening already. So Matt and I were wondering that if you were in charge, Nick, of the UK today, you were elected Prime Minister, how would you tackle this cost of living crisis? What would be your approach?
I think the first thing to recognise, and probably to be truthful with people about, is that whilst the UK is an energy importer, there are real costs on the UK economy that somebody is going to have to bear, and that there is no magic way out of that. And I think our experience of the pandemic is that the general public are not stupid or irresponsible, and that in difficult situations people can face up to those sorts of messages. So because I've worked in energy efficiency for 30 years, the first thing I would do would be ramp the energy efficiency programs back up to where I and colleagues have been arguing they ought to be for the last 10 years, but they haven't been. But as I said earlier, that's a long-term, long run in the economist sense. It involves capital investment approach that will have big benefits in the long term to the overall efficiency with which we provide energy services, but it's not going to solve the short-term affordability crisis, which is not an efficiency crisis really. It's a distributional crisis. So this is bad news for people who are on higher incomes, who will have to pay higher energy bills, but it's disastrous news for people on low incomes, who will have to pay higher energy bills because energy costs are regressive at a far higher fraction of household income for low-income households. There's only really two ways to address that. One is to intervene on prices, and the other is to intervene on incomes. It's interesting the idea that we should intervene on prices, which is now almost the norm, and yet it's only 9 months ago at COP26 that we were berating countries for subsidising energy, developing countries mainly. So you have to slightly worry about consistency there, though I do actually think that the rises have been so dramatic that some intervention on prices has to happen. The other intervention you can make is on incomes. You can give poor people more income through benefits or through specific tax changes like VAT. Neither of those is very easy to do. The two factors you need to think about are how well targeted is the intervention, how much is it giving money to the lowest income households in the worst efficient housing or the people most in need. So that's one thing you need to think about.
What about the balance, Nick, between, to my mind, whichever way you move, you want people to take energy efficiency measures where they can and save energy. But on the other hand, you don't want them to be, in discomfort. And I wonder about the boundary. How do you, is it possible for a policymaker really to get that right?
I don't think there's a single right answer to that problem. I mean, you've defined the problem very well there, Matt. I don't think that prices, very high prices alone, drive energy efficiency investment to the extent that's needed. To a large extent, because the poorest households or most affected can't afford the energy efficiency investment. So in that sense, a pure market approach doesn't work very well. The thing you need to take into account also is that it's more than just comfort. For those of us, say, who turned our if we turn our thermostats from 20 to 18, that's about comfort. If you turn your thermostat from 17 to 12, it becomes about health. And we already have a large number of people in the UK who die each year because their homes are too cold. And I think, to be blunt about it, there's going to be an even bigger number in next winter who die for that reason. I would expect politicians in a democracy to take that very seriously. So, yeah, I think that those issues about the poorest people not being able to afford to live in a way that most of us would consider reasonable, those would be top of my agenda. But that's a political statement, but it's one I'd be prepared to defend.
In that sense, whatever help is given has to be targeted, first and foremost at the people who are going to be in the worst position. And a lot, as you say, a lot of people are going to be in a terrible position this winter with where prices are going, knowing that we have a lot of people, of all different ages, but especially elderly, who can't, even now, as you say, have struggled to heat their homes effectively, struggled to keep warm all winter. I was wondering, whether there's more could be done, especially this winter, in bringing communal spaces together, for instance, as an emergency measure to give people somewhere to go in order to stay warm during the day, for instance.
I think there is increasing discussion of that, and we're seeing, I saw yesterday that it was reported that library and museum services were seriously considering having this function as a warm space for people to go. You could see that schools, particularly primary schools, might play a similar function. I have mixed feelings about it. I can see that is something that will be necessary, but it does seem very sad to me we've reached the point that point in this country where we sort of give up on the idea that people might be able to have a home that's livable in, to put it bluntly. Which is why I personally think that the hit that we're taking economically on this front should be borne out of general taxation rather than on the backs of the poorest people in society.
And then a massive program of insulation, of improvements to buildings and investment perhaps in replacing boilers for air source heat pumps, targeted at the people who are the least well off in society, to try and over time improve that situation.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. To the extent you've got energy efficiency programs, there are two things you can do. One is to ramp them up, but as I said, on its own in the short term, that's not hugely effective. The other is to target them on the people who need them most, and that's not always an easy thing to do, because people don't necessarily self-identify as being hugely in need. But I think there are agencies, local government, charities, campaign groups who work on energy poverty in particular and poverty in general, who can usefully point people in the right direction there.
Are there other barriers to bringing about energy efficiency? Because it seems it makes sense economically, and you talked about the initial investment and whether people can afford it, but are there other barriers? Why does it take so long for people to catch on that energy efficiency is the way to go?
It's a good question, and there's been a lot of work over the last 30 years on that. I mean, certainly the capital investment barrier is a very important point, and my colleague Brenda Boardman pointed out 30 years ago that what makes fuel poverty different from other forms of poverty is this point about capital investment, that it's a lack of capital rather than a lack of income that's the main distinguishing factor for fuel poverty. There are other barriers, knowing what to do, knowing what can be done, having a supply chain out there that can deliver it. So at the moment, there isn't really a profession of people who can tell you how to upgrade a typical, say, Victorian terraced house. That's not a job that anybody has ever developed, and we need that sort of business model to develop, driven by regulations about what you can and can't do in an energy efficiency investment. But the supply chain isn't there for some of these more complex and difficult measures either. Certainly not a supply chain that is sufficiently skilled to do the more complex work that's needed to reach very high energy performance standards. So you mentioned earlier, Bettina, that you have a foot in two camps in Europe. In Britain, anybody can claim to be a builder. You just say, I am a builder. You don't have to have any skills or qualifications at all. And I think that tells us something about how we've historically treated the importance of good building in the UK.
Is that true in Germany?
No. That's the short answer to that. Although, it used to be highly regulated, whereas now it's a little less regulated. But you have to go through a number of years of training, and you have to learn from more senior people, and the different levels of the job. So it's not just the builder, but different types of seniority, so you can easily see what kind of training people have and who they've learned from.
So we've of course done that in some buildings trades in the UK, notably in gas engineers and electricians. So we've done it where there's a health and safety issue, an obvious health and safety issue. And it's always been the case, I think, that it shows us we don't treat environment as equally important as health and safety, that we don't apply the same standards to carbon emission to trades that can deliver carbon emissions reductions to those that just deliver health and safety.
So a better approach to building standards, perhaps through regulation of builders themselves in the UK.
Yeah, standards and culture as well. I'm not getting at the trades here. I think it's our culture as users of those trades as well. Do we just want the cheapest job we can get, or do we want a job that's done at an appropriate level for a modern building stock?
Very good. So, Bettina, I don't think there's any other burning questions.
No, it sounds like there's a lot of work to do for the energy systems hub in Osney Mead coming up.
Yeah, I reckon so. You'll be keeping yourselves pretty busy, and all the people that are there in the hub keeping themselves pretty busy, sharing ideas and innovating. bringing forward new concepts, I guess, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody, particularly anybody who's based in Oxfordshire, works in Oxfordshire, lives in Oxfordshire, do get in contact with us, because a lot of the work will be local, though. As a university institute, the Zero Institute will, of course, be looking to collaborate nationally and globally as well.
Well, we'll maybe you invite us down sometime. We can pop along, bring some of our energy consultants down to chat with people. Maybe that could be also a good chance for sharing of ideas.
That would be great. Yeah.
So with that, I'd like to thank you, Nick, for joining us as ever. Thanks very much for that, and thanks, Bettina, also.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here today.
Well, thanks very much for listening to Fueling the Transition from AFRY Management Consulting. I hope you enjoyed our podcast, and know we'll be putting another one up before too long. So please subscribe. We're available on all the usual channels, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.